The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio. Where faith comes to life.
Hello, it's Justin Briley presenting this week's Profile, the show where you get to meet all sorts of interesting Christians in all walks of life, and brought to you in partnership with Premier Christianity magazine, a great monthly mag, and you can request a free copy of the latest edition by visiting premierchristianity.com/free sample. Today's Profile is a conversation with Sohrab Ahmari, who grew up in Iran, became an atheist in his teens after moving to the USA, and went on to become an adult convert to Catholicism. He's a widely published journalist and social commentator in the USA, and I had the pleasure of hosting the UK launch of his recent book, The Unbroken Thread for Hodder Faith. Today on The Profile, you'll hear our conversation. Let's get to know you a little bit first, though, Sohrab. I think, is this your second book that you've written?
It's my second feature or major book. While I was living in Britain, actually, which we can get into, I published a short kind of polemic, just a 20,000 word polemic about art and identity politics. So if you count that, then it's my third book.
Great. I think the book before this was more about your own faith journey, wasn't it, and how you came to become a Catholic. Tell us a little bit about that journey, because it's not spelt out in great detail in this book, but I'd love to hear a bit before we get into this one.
Sure. So that book is titled From Fire by Water, My Journey to the Catholic Faith. I'll try to give a summary version of it, but for people who are interested, actually Hodder is going to bring out a UK edition at some point in the future. So I was born and raised in Tehran, Iran, to a very secular family, Muslim nominally, but my parents didn't really practice, and they were kind of bohemians, you might say. My mom was an artist. My dad was an architect. I was surrounded with Western books and movies and ideas at home. It just happened to be that home was situated within a larger society that had just gone through the Islamic Revolution, and the new Islamic Republic had come to power. And so I grew up with this kind of behind closed doors, outside closed doors tension, where at home, like I said, my parents drank alcohol and used forbidden watchwords like democracy, and then, but in public we had to pretend to be adherents of the, Islamic Revolution. And so at age 13, that tension led me to conclude that, religion is just a kind of public hypocrisy imposed by the Ayatollahs or what have you, and I declared myself an atheist, or at least privately to myself. I didn't broadcast it, certainly not at school. And then a year later, or not long after that, we immigrated, my mother and I, to the United States, thanks to an uncle who had gotten us what's called the Family Preference Visa Program, aka chain migration, as President Trump used to call it. And my idea of the West was, the West is super secular, it's individualistic, it's quote unquote rational, therefore not tainted by the superstition that prevailed in my native land. And my idea of the West was like this kind of decadent Manhattan of the 1980s, as you would see in the movies. And then what had actually happened is we, boarded a plane, and the plane took off. And as you know, you see a flight path in a television screen on the airplane, and we went right over Manhattan, and we stopped somewhere called Salt Lake City, Utah. When I got out, I was surrounded by Latter-day Saints, Mormons, and America was, in fact, at least that pocket of America was very religious. It was very communitarian even, and not individualistic. And so I rebelled against that too. I almost instantly sort of shifted my oppositional energies, which had hitherto been directed against the Iranian mullahs, and directed them against kind of, you would say, Judeo-Christian morality and tradition as I encountered it in the United States. It took a long time. 20 years from that, I went through the typical intellectual maturation that a lot of people in the West go through, in that in college I became a Trotskyist, and then gradually as I left college I became more of a you might say a liberal, or even a kind of small c conservative gradually, and then through a long process of reading, where I actually, instead of kind of dismissing the Bible eventually sat down and read it, and it really spoke to me. It sent it to the sense that I had that I have an interior voice, the conscience, which seemed to tell me that there was an objective moral order, which suggested that there must be some Lord of that order, namely God. And then, in Genesis, for example, that interior voice takes on this external voice of God telling Cain, "What have you done? What have you done? Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." Eventually, to make a long story short, I came to be convinced that there is a God, a personal God, and ultimately the personal God as I encountered him in Christianity and specifically the Catholic faith. And I was received into the church actually in December 2016 in Britain at the Brompton Oratory. And I went in, and I had gone to a few masses before, and as I write in the book, these masses really moved me. The idea of a God who submits to humiliation by his own creatures. You couldn't make that up in a way. I mean, if you were to set out to create a religion, you wouldn't create a God like that. And they very much moved me. And at this particular mass, and the Brompton Oratory is known for very kind of elaborate traditional liturgy, I finally decided to become a Catholic. So I knocked on the rectory door, and the priest opened, and I said, "I wish to become a Roman Catholic," and he didn't miss a beat. He just said, "Very well, I shall instruct you." So,
yes, I'm sure there are many priests who wish that the people would knock on their door and say they want to become a Christian or a Catholic. The book here it is, The Unbroken Thread: Discovering the Wisdom of Tradition in an Age of Chaos. Really enjoyed reading it. Thank you for writing it, Sohrab.
Thank you, John.
And I love the UK cover, don't you? It's. I mean, I'm going to be a bit biased here, but I think it's better than the US cover. I think it's a really nice cover.
I off the record, I'll share my opinion. But as it is, it's like choosing between my children.
Of course it is. But I think this is remarkable. It's had some rave reviews. You've got Peter Frankopan, Douglas Murray, Tom Holland, Giles Fraser, among others, with endorsements on the back. And I can see why. It's just a really fascinating book, because what you've done in this book is you've asked big questions about our culture and where we are, but you've framed it through the stories of people through history. Tell us a bit about what the sort of genesis of this book was, and also tell us about your little son, Max, who features kind of bookends the book in some ways. Tell us about that aspect of it as well.
Sure. So this is a book, as you said, I wrote for my son, Max. He was 2 years old when I started. He's now 4 years old. And he was born of kind of my anxieties about what kind of a man our contemporary political, cultural, economic arrangements will chisel out of him. So my Max is named after Saint Maximilian Kolbe, who is he's actually one of the kind of Christian figures whose statue appears kind of flanks Westminster Abbey, and so he's one of the great modern Christian martyrs. He was a Polish Franciscan friar who famously laid down his life for a stranger at Auschwitz. The Nazis had picked this man to be executed, and he cried out, "My wife, my children." And when St. Maximilian heard this, he offered to take his place in the starvation chamber. So when I heard that story, I was so moved by it that I, obviously, as Catholics do, I named my son after him. But to me, that act of naming him was a way to try to tether my son to the account of freedom that Maximilian Kolbe exemplified with this great act. An account of freedom, really an icon of Christian freedom, that you find your freedom not in self-willing, which you can't really do in a concentration camp, but actually in accepting limits, surrender, sacrifice, duty, even unto death. And as I write in the introduction of the book, I have that account of freedom, which is ultimately rooted in kind of our pre-modern heritage, both Christian and classical or Greco-Roman. And then my nightmare for my Max is that when he's Maximilian Kolbe's age, he's just living a life of kind of purposeless decadence. Chances are, given the way our society works, that he'll inherit his parents' elite status. So I'm not worried that he'll be, God forbid, like an opioid addict or something, but that, he'll come back from college and all he cares about is getting ahead career-wise and quote unquote keeping his options open, and therefore never really actually exercising his true freedom. He never actually commits to anything in a definitive way or something larger than himself. And so I want to try to counteract, frankly, that a culture that makes it so that children do grow up like that. It deforms children. So how do I do that? I pose, as you said, I pose unasked questions, or questions that our age assumes have been answered or been made superfluous by science and technology, or otherwise just aren't worth asking anymore, when in fact they're still pertinent to a full and happy life and a truly free life. And because I'm not a theologian, I'm not a philosopher, I'm just a journalist and a storyteller, I work through those questions through the lives of 12 great thinkers, some of them predictable ones like C.S. Lewis or John Henry Newman, but some of them who are, will surprise people in a book about tradition. You'll have the feminist Andrea Dworkin, or the Jewish philosopher Hans Jonas, a modern philosopher of Gnosticism, some lesser known figures as well. I mean, some of them are these kind of marquee names like Solzhenitsyn or St. Thomas or Augustine, but others are lesser known but worth knowing.
Is it your worry that in a modern age we have essentially forgotten that wisdom of those thinkers? And obviously not all of these thinkers that you're profiling are Christian by any stretch of the imagination, but I don't know. I mean, is it just that we don't read the old books anymore, and it's whatever is the latest thing in our newsfeed is the thing that we think is the wise opinion, and we perhaps forget the fact that there is hard-won wisdom down the ages before us?
I mean, you're exactly right, Justin, and that's right. I mean, C.S. Lewis called it chronological snobbery, and it's the idea that because you've come in later in time, you must be right because you've superseded the past. And you might, another word for it might be presentism, and it's something that I was very much guilty of, I think, in my late teens and early 20s myself, which is why I wrote this particular book for a kind of young reader in some ways, although plenty of older readers have liked it too. But when I was an undergraduate student, and I was a philosophy major, I always wondered, like, why would you read Plato or Aristotle? You did read them. Blessedly, in my age, you still had to sort of go through the basics. But I was always wondered, like, well, this is these people thought their thoughts when we didn't know about electromagnetism or evolution. So what would Aristotle have to teach us today? So I think that's a real tendency of especially an age that thinks about history as progressive, and therefore if history is progressive, then the ideas of the past must have been debunked somehow just by mere fact of them being older. Yeah. So it's a real concern. Yeah.
Yeah. Freedom is a significant theme in the book. As you say, framing the whole thing is the story of Maximilian Kolbe, patron saint of your son, and his act of laying down his freedom because of his greater freedom, if you like. And we'll come on to some of those chapters that deal with the nature of freedom a bit later on in the conversation. But one of the ones, that struck me the most is probably the one that I hadn't heard of, the one example of a couple in this case that I hadn't heard of, that you talk about in the chapter that's called "Can You Be Spiritual Without Being Religious?" And this is Vic and Edie Turner. And just tell us a little bit about this couple and why you use their particular story to answer this question about whether we can be spiritual without being religious.
Sure. So if I may very briefly, since you mentioned freedom as this kind of unifying theme, as you said, there's this kind of very disparate cast of characters: Confucius, Andrew Dworkin, Seneca, Augustine, the Turners. So what ties all of these figures together, and we'll get to it with the Turners, is this idea that actually various traditional and natural limits make us free, that accepting them they are paradoxically liberatory. And conversely, the loss of those limits, which has happened kind of in an accelerated fashion over the past maybe 2-3 centuries, also paradoxically leaves us less free. And we only notice that when we've lost the limits, that they did something for us, that to be unbound isn't necessarily to be free, that there's all sorts of anxiety and unhappiness bound up with that. And that if you have a sense of ordered continuity, which is tradition, some steps that lead up behind you, and then you kind of these steps that lead forward, then you can leap into the future in a free and kind of confident way. So anyway, that's kind of what ties all these otherwise very kind of disparate characters together. So Vic and Edie Turner, speaking of ordered continuity, were a pair of British anthropologists in the post-war era. They were kind of very much influential in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and really laid the foundation sort of for the modern anthropology of religion. And they were, they met because both of them were militantly secular. They were, fans of Marx, eventually both card-carrying members of the Communist Party of Great Britain. But they had a great interest in ritual, in trying to understand how ritual structures traditional or tribal societies, and what that might tell us about modern societies. So, an obvious contrast that they would notice, and we notice today, is that in traditional societies, the passage from childhood to adulthood, or boyhood to manhood, is marked by these kind of distinct rituals. Whereas in the West, in the modern West, childhood just sort of imperceptibly bleeds into adulthood. And they wondered, okay, why do traditional tribal peoples do this? And so they ended up spending 2.5 years in then what was then called Rhodesia, the British colony of northern Rhodesia, in what's now Zambia. And they spent time with a tribe called the Ndembu, is a small tribe, and they noticed that ritual does all sorts of things for the community that otherwise they wouldn't be able to do, that it helps them in ways that no other human activity quite does the same as religious rituals. So that, for example, in a selection of a chief, what the chief goes through is this ritual of humiliation before he actually becomes the chieftain. He's insulted, he's mocked, and he's supposed to take it. And it's part of the process of becoming the chieftain. And they notice that what that does is it reminds the newly installed chief that his power is really only for the service of the people. He's not just gaining power for its own sake, but to help his community. And other sorts of there are various kinds of intractable conflicts between individuals or family members, and they are resolved through ritual because both submit to something larger than themselves, and then the interpersonal tensions are accounted for and explained and resolved through this kind of larger account of what it means to be fully human, or the ultimate existence of mankind. And the rituals that they noticed, or that they wrote about and they observed, so moved them and were so transformative in a sense that ultimately they became Catholics themselves. When they returned to England, they converted to Catholicism, which they felt was the most kind of ritualistic expression of Christianity.
Yeah. I was going to say, though, that they came from a pretty secular, atheistic, frankly, sort of tradition when it came to the anthropology and sociology that they did. But they obviously encountered something which went beyond, for them, simply some kind of evolutionary psychological explanation for why people undertake these rituals. And that is the way a lot of, the modern world would dismiss it. They wouldn't say, they would effectively say, well, we can explain this. They've got their reasons, but, we've moved on. We now understand why women have trouble conceiving, and we know that rituals don't, change these things. So what was it that shifted their mindset in that sense to say, because they would understand that as well, as modern people, but what was it that made them realize, no, this is actually important, doing things that express your humanity and faith and everything else in this kind of ritualistic way. Why did they suddenly change their mind on that?
I mean, there's a particular ritual about which Vic ended up writing multiple kind of essays and entire books called the Shiamba ritual, which is the penitential rite of the Ndembu people. And if you bear with me, I mean, I'll just summarize it very briefly. It was so striking to them that ultimately they concluded that it was a product of what you might call natural revelation, that somehow divine revelation, which you get in scripture or what have you, is mirrored in the practices of mirrored, however murkily, in the practices of an unevangelized people like the Ndembu. And it was this, whenever really serious disaster strikes an individual or a group of individuals in Ndembu society, they perform this rite in which their major ancestral spirit, some kind of African god or bush god, enters the history of his people, and he is, in order to solve the problems of his people, he submits to their humiliation. They set up a kind of tabernacle where they kind of create a figure of him using sort of mortar and sort of sheets and pieces of wood or whatever, and all the villagers come up and strike at it, and then they are told that they've killed the god, but that they're innocent of it ultimately, that he somehow redeemed them in undergoing this. And then they go under with him and they share a meal, kind of a Eucharist, frankly, to use the which is where the beans are associated with this embodied God who has come down from the upper realm of the gods, and he's entered history to redeem his people through his own death. And so when they saw that, they, obviously they knew something about Christianity, and they thought, well, this is that there's something in the human spirit that longs for a self-sacrificing God, that and that who resolves our tensions and redeems us through his own undergoing or going under. And I don't know if that's the only source of them ultimately deciding to become Christians, but it told them that ritual is its own thing, that human beings have this kind of profound insight that is very hard to explain otherwise, but that there is such a thing as revelation, which you can then access and bring into your own life using ritual. Yes.
And it feels like, obviously it was significant for them in their own conversion effectively to Catholicism. They felt that was where they saw that ritual most physically expressed, if you like, in a local community. I mean, of course, and coming back to the question that the chapter's based on, can you be spiritual without being religious? I mean, that has been a mantra for many people, modern people, hasn't it? Well, I'm spiritual but not religious, because people don't approve anymore in a sense of organized religion. That's where all the bad stuff happens and the control happens. But I can be spiritual myself in my own private space. I can do my little, yoga meditations. I can, have sort of the incense or whatever in my room to kind of give me that. And there's this sort of privatized kind of spirituality that I think a lot of people think, well, I'm getting the best of what, that old stuff used to give people. I'm having the spirituality minus the religion. What's the problem as far as you're concerned? And how does this particular example sort of speak into that sort of current way of thinking?
Sure. Yeah. So about actually 20% of Americans now identify as spiritual but not religious. So it's a real phenomenon. I don't know if they've done polling in Britain to see what the equivalent.
It's probably very similar, I imagine.
Something like that. Yeah. And the problem with spiritual but not religious isn't the spiritual side. Isn't the religious side. It's the spiritual side that it's. Such practitioners actually do have religiosity in the sense that they have some rituals. As you said, they practice various kind of austerities on Fridays. I only do spinning and then I only drink juice or whatever. But what's lacking is as spirituality, they don't tap into any kind of larger account of what it means to be fully human that's publicly shared. And so, as you said, it's privatized spirituality. So there's all sorts of benefits to set aside the benefits in terms of your salvation of your eternal soul. There's all sorts of temporal benefits in the here and now that people gain from religious communities, but it has to have a group dimension and this sense of you're part of something larger than yourself and these kind of meanings that have been handed down the generations. Whereas if you just think, spirituality, my spirituality is lighting candles, and then I do cycling on my Peloton, and that makes me feel very kind of elated, and then I sort of meditate for half hour. You don't. If you fail to do it, at most you'll say, "Well, I'm bummed out that I didn't get to do it," but it doesn't have any of the kind of existential seriousness that religion does, and therefore doesn't fulfill all the other functions that religion does in traditional societies. And I wonder that some of the practices that we have, for example, on social media, provide the sort of substitute religious aspect. So, for example, not to get too political, but there is a kind of tendency to do rituals of penance on Twitter, right? If you've said the wrong thing, if you've violated a kind of various speech codes, then you say, I have sinned, my brothers and sisters, through my fault, and I'm going to work through it. But unfortunately, there's no redemption in the Twitter rituals. In fact, they're kind of once you've ran afoul of the rules, you're sort of banished forever, and there's not this opportunity of being you're excommunicated without any opportunity of returning to communion.
It's interesting, isn't it? You say that, because I often think we live in a sense, increasingly post-Christian West, but I don't think we're any less religious. We just find religion in other things very often, and it may be in a particular political perspective or ideology or whatever, and that becomes sacrosanct. That becomes the boundary, and you have your heretics, and you have your priests, and you have your holy texts, and you have your the rituals, as you say, for those who transgress. And and that's something you cover in various ways in the book. You're listening to The Profile on Premier Christian Radio with me, Justin Briley, in conversation today with author Sohrab Ahmari on his recent book, The Unbroken Thread, Discovering the Wisdom of Tradition in an Age of Chaos. Today's show is also available via our podcast. Do rate and review us if you're listening that way. It helps others to discover the show, and we'll be back with more shortly.
Holier than thou.
Radical.
Delusional.
Ignorant.
Perfect. It's time to challenge stereotypes about Christians, and Premier Christianity is leading the way.
Transform your perceptions, broaden your horizons, open your mind to wide-ranging views.
Read interviews with politicians, theologians, and TV presenters.
Discover the breadth of the Christian spectrum.
Be provoked, react, inspired, and informed. Get the print magazine and full online access for just £4.95 a month. Subscribe today at premierchristianity.com.
Premier Christianity Magazine.
The bigger picture. The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio.
Hello, welcome back to this week's edition of The Profile with me, Justin Briley, the show where you get to meet all sorts of interesting Christians in all walks of life, and brought to you in partnership with Premier Christianity Magazine. If you'd like to request a free copy of the latest edition of the mag, do visit premierchristianity.com/free sample. Today's profile is a conversation between myself and Sohrab Ahmari, who is a US journalist and social commentator and author of the recently published book, The Unbroken Thread. And today's conversation was recorded for the UK launch of the book, and we'll pick up the conversation as I ask him about the stories and characters profiled in the book. I mean, let's move to another character that you profile, Solzhenitsyn, in a chapter called What is Freedom For? Now, this one I had heard of, but for those who maybe aren't very familiar, can you just give us a potted history of who Solzhenitsyn was and the story that you open this chapter with, where he's addressing, I think it's Harvard University at a very prestigious event. Tell us about that.
Sure. So Alexander Solzhenitsyn was great Russian dissident under the Soviet Union, had initially supported the Soviet ideology, but then he had written these kind of mild jokes about Joseph Stalin in private letters while he was fighting in the Second World War, and those letters finally made their way to the hands of the secret police, and so then he was condemned for nearly a decade to the Gulag, that network of camps the Soviets ran for political prisoners. And when he got out, then he began to write about what he had experienced in the Gulag. And these exposés, some written in novel form, some as historiography, most famously the novel One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, and then the Gulag Archipelago, which was kind of this vast history of the Gulag system, ultimately made it to the West, and they made it very hard for apologists of the Soviet Union, which, as you know, it had a lot of defenders among Western intellectuals especially. It made it much harder for them to defend the regime. Ultimately, in doing so, he helped bring about the downfall of the Soviet Union with his literary activity. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature for this work, and then in 1974 he was exiled and he came to the United States. Well, first he came to Europe, and then eventually he migrated to the United States. And in 1978 he was asked to give a commencement address for graduates, for the graduating class of Harvard University. For the most part, he had tried to avoid any kind of publicity, but in this case, because it was Harvard and this kind of preeminent academic institution, he decided to agree. And as he wrote in his memoir, he said that what was expected of me was the kind of typical immigrant's ode to America. I've escaped tyranny and I've come to the West, and thank God for my newfound freedoms. But in fact, famously or infamously, as it were, he delivered a Jeremiah against the West, a critique of the West. And specifically, what he argued was that obviously he detested the Soviet regime, and he hated to the end of his days because it was this lawless tyranny. But what he suggested was that the West was also deformed in some way, and it owed to the fact that that a kind of excess of rights and individualism had paradoxically robbed Western life of its true freedom, and it had empowered, they had lowered the moral horizon of human beings to the level of, I'm just a self-seeking individual. I will rationally maximize my own interest. That is the kind of liberal ideology of the West. And, he saw it in various ways. He saw it in how the Western media behaved. He saw it in the kind of strange conformism of the Western Academy, but especially in the commercial practices of the West, where he was himself a kind of victim of, frankly, kind of predatory behavior that was legal. What infuriated him was that it was all legal, and that the law said, as long as you get it in writing and seek to do for yourself, you could go for it.
It feels almost as though he'd gone from one situation where there was no freedom, under the Soviet sort of system, the gulags and so on, to the opposite extreme, experiencing that in the US, where freedom, in a sense, was so sacrosanct that it almost trumped the fact that we should actually treat people in certain ways. I mean, you start the whole chapter actually, and this book was written obviously near the beginning really of the pandemic, of a particular instance where some entrepreneurs, for want of a better word, decided to try and buy up as much of the hand sanitizer and face masks and that kind of thing in the US as possible, so that they could make a healthy profit by selling them at a very steep rate online. And this, for you, epitomized, to some extent, the concerns that Solzhenitsyn had about where our freedoms may take us. I mean, how are you connecting those two things together?
Yeah, I mean, it's not even that he would say that the West was too free. What Solzhenitsyn suggested was that insofar as the modern Western account of freedom made no distinction between freedom to do what you ought to do and the license to do what you really ought not to do from a kind of proper moral frame, then in fact, Westerners are also less free, but in a less the Western unfreedom, unlike the Soviet variety, which was a result of this kind of massive centralized brutal state, the Western unfreedom was more diffuse and privatized, so that the tyranny that Westerners suffered was often at the hands of private actors. That might mean large corporations, for example, exploiting workers, or now today you have kind of the threat of big tech. And if you take a strictly quote unquote libertarian view and you say, well, it's a private actor, it can do whatever it wants, then you do away with all sorts of other moral goods that are important to a society and help us really be free. Or it was the kind of private tyranny of the individual against himself, in the sense that because the West was so quote unquote liberated, people are slaves to their own base appetites. And, whether that's addiction to pornography or addiction to drugs or other sorts of addictions that ultimately make you less free, but it's sold as under the mantra of liberation. So it's just to be very clear, he wouldn't say, I think, that the West is too free. He would say that insofar as our account of freedom makes no distinction between freedom for good and freedom for evil, in fact, we are also not as free as human beings should or can be.
Yeah, which sort of takes you back to that, Maximilian Kolbe in the death camp, and he was not free in the sense that he was a prisoner of the Nazis, but at the same time, he was arguably the most free person on the planet
in Europe.
Yeah, exactly. Because of his willingness to simply give his life away in that situation. There's different kinds of freedom, aren't there? Ultimately, that are valuable. Just before we go to the final chapter I want to draw out in our conversation, I just want to say, if anyone's watching and would like to ask a question, you're very welcome to pop one in the comments wherever you're watching, on Facebook or on YouTube, and we'll try and weave any of those in as they come in. But just for those who have joined us and are not sure exactly what we're talking about, let me remind you, it's The Unbroken Thread, Discovering the Wisdom of Tradition in an Age of Chaos. I'm Justin Briley, and Sohrab Ahmari is my guest for this special broadcast from Hod of Faith, because today is the launch of this book in the UK. And I've just been admiring its beautiful cover as well. It's the contents are just as good, though. And I really enjoyed reading it this week in preparation for this interview, Sohrab. Again, freedom comes out in the chapter on Andrea Dworkin. Now, tell us again who Andrea Dworkin is, for those who aren't familiar with the name. And it's in a chapter called Is Sex a Private Matter?, where you delve into, very modern issues around the availability of pornography online and everything else. And Andrea Dworkin herself, at the time she was active, was concerned about this even back in the 1970s and so on. So tell us a little bit about this and how Andrea Dworkin plays into this whole issue.
Sure. So Andrea Dworkin was one of the most ferociously radical feminists in the American feminist tradition, active in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and into the 90s. She was known for her opposition, especially to pornography and prostitution, which she felt that degraded women, and she had ultimately, in this tug of war between two different strands of feminism in the 1980s, she represented what was called anti-pornography feminism, which was less liberal in the sense that it was prepared, for example, to ban pornography if it meant stopping the degradation of women on screen and so forth. But she lost that tug of war to a group that called itself sex positive feminists, who in a way emerged in direct opposition to Andrea Dworkin's tendency, to Andrea Dworkin herself. And, they suggested that porn or prostitution even can be liberating for women as long as they kind of take charge of it or what have you. But she was a kind of very controversial figure, famous for kind of just wearing overalls, kind of intellectually combative, but also a brilliant writer and thinker. Obviously, I wouldn't agree with Andrea Dworkin. I'm more of a traditional Catholic, but I think there are things that we can, that should bring her tradition into coherence and alliance with a lot of traditional religious believers, if they can get past certain differences. And
it's a fascinating person to sort of take up this issue of, as I say, the question that heads up the chapter is sex a private matter? Because in a way, it feels like this ties into the freedom thing, doesn't it? There's this sense that with the 60s and the sexual revolution, increasingly there was this sense that we're freer now. We can do what we want. We're not tied down by the Victorian attitudes of our forebears and so on. But the sort of, where has that taken us, I suppose? Arguably, you could say it's taken us to Pornhub and to this sort of complete sexualization almost of so many parts of culture. And without wanting to sound like prurient reactionaries, even many secular people who perhaps are in favor of, generally speaking, freedom and freedom of the internet and everything else, I think that a lot of people are waking up to the fact that this is having serious psychological effects for a generation of young people who are now, this has become normative, what they see online, the way it's rewiring people's brains when they become addicted to pornography and that sort of thing. So it's kind of, for me, it all ties into that sort of whole thing of, we think we're free, but often when we take those freedoms to their logical conclusion, we find ourselves less free than we were to start with.
Yeah, and the way I describe it is that we live in an age of, when I say now, I mean in 2021, but the trend was there when Andrea Dworkin was active. She's passed away now, but that we live in an age of sexual schizophrenia. In the one hand, we're told that all sex is, more or less, nearly all sex is good. It's private. Just have fun, as long as you seek consent from your partner and practice the latest hygienic guidelines to avoid disease. Do what you want. On the other hand, we live also in the age of Me Too, where we're beginning to notice, like you said, the effects of pornography. Even if you're a secular, that it's done something to the way that men and boys, young men and boys, relate to women. The fact that they encounter pornography now, according to one study, that 9 out of 10 boys will have seen hardcore pornography before hitting puberty. That's a pretty bizarre development in the moral history of our species, and kind of unprecedented. Legitimate. That people say various things are unprecedented, that are in fact precedented, but this is legitimately unprecedented. Yeah. Or we also are kind of aware of kind of various monstrous criminality that came about as a result of came to light as a result of the Me Too movement. Jeffrey Epstein, Harvey Weinstein, and others of the kind, where we're having this reckoning. And so it seems like, the sex liberation of the 60s and 70s has brought us, in some ways, to a pretty dark place. And Andrea Dworkin is an important figure in that regard, because she was in the thick of the sexual revolution, and at the time was warning that this is not working out well for women and children, especially, that it's just empowering caddish men. The central argument I try to take away from her in the chapter is that sex is not a private matter, that what people do in the bedroom ripples out to a society. So again, to go back to the Pornhub example, we have all sorts of pretensions in our society, in our public lives, to women's equality, to respect for the dignity of women, and which is great. But that's belied by the fact that 100 million people visit Pornhub daily. And they're kind of some of the most popular categories are some of the most viciously violent ones, where women are slapped and so forth. So Andrea Dworkin would say that that our public pretensions are undermined by what we do when we set our browsers to incognito mode. And strangely or ironically, I suggest that's an argument also that you can find in St. Augustine, who's one of the characters in the book. He has his own chapter, but Augustine also believed that somehow what happens in the bedroom, the threat of a lust for domination, the libido dominandi of the bedroom, can ripple out to a wider society, meaning Roman society in his time, and that what happens in this kind of smaller unit shapes a whole culture or a civilization. So that sex, for Augustine, as much for Andrew Dworkin, for neither of them, sex is kind of innocent of political dynamics or totally not contoured by larger public concerns.
But wouldn't an Andrea Dworkin, as a feminist of her time and many feminists today have said, Christianity is hardly the solution. Indeed, that has been subjugating women forever, and the marriage has become a place for women, where they are essentially put in their place, and sex continues to be that in the vast majority of cases. So where do you go, to that kind of critique of Andrea Dworkin as well? Yeah,
I mean, she would say that and that's, most of the chapters of this book, when I almost entirely am uncritical toward the subject of the chapter, but with the Andrew Dworkin chapter, I think with a couple of others, but mainly for the Andrew Dworkin chapter, is one where I part ways with the subject of the chapter, in the sense that Dworkin believed, as you just said, that all of the kind of natural law regulations that the church adopted, inherited from the Greco-Roman tradition, and made part of its own moral system, and everything else about how Christianity tried to alter or tried to reshape relations between men and women, was just aimed at perpetuating male supremacism. And that just seems implausible. How do you explain, in a pagan Roman context, a religion that comes around and says, no, not only should men not lust after other women, but men shouldn't even kind of lustfully approach their own wives, because their wives are also human beings imbued with the divine spark, carrying the image of the Almighty? Or how do you explain the kind of humanizing fact about kind of the Christianization of the Roman Empire, how it altered, again, the status of women? As you know, women were some of the first to embrace Christianity in the Roman Empire, precisely because it held up men and women as equally made in the image of God, and therefore possessing a kind of complementary dignity. And conversely, I would say to an Andrew Dworkin, what has the removal of the barriers that Christianity imposed on human lust and human sexuality, what has that removal done? Has it actually brought us to an age of greater dignity for women, or has it rather empowered the Harvey Weinsteins of the world, the Jeffrey Epsteins and so forth? And I would venture that it's the latter. It's actually just empowered. The removal of those barriers has not freed women. Now, Andrew Dworkin may agree that the removal of barriers hasn't made women freer, but she's not prepared to say maybe we should re-erect those barriers. And that's where I part ways with her.
Sure. I mean, it feels to me like overall, it's one of those cases where something that has been treated in a sense as incredibly important and having this wide social significance, the sexual act, has sort of been removed from that. And now it's just a pleasure, when it's made simply about consent and pleasure and a kind of removed from any sense of faithfulness or lifelong commitment and so on. What happens in that process? What happens when sexuality, sex becomes commodified in that way, rather in the way that, religion can become privatized, as we were saying in its previous way. What happens in a culture when you start to treat these kinds of things in that kind of way, Sohrab?
I think you just begin to treat people more and more like things. And you, in the same way that everything else is commoditized, this relationship also becomes commoditized. And so, you have a phenomenon only something like OnlyFans, where any woman is potentially is on camera, and people, various people around the world are sending her quote unquote tips, and the question becomes, for the fact that person has signed their name to a document giving consent, does that make it any less degrading?
Exploitative.
What I find very frustrating is, I just think, when we talk about these things, like why was the law of matrimony so important to not just Christian civilization, but all traditional civilizations? Why was it so important to direct the human sexual impulse to ultimately to uniting man and woman and to the nurturing of children? You begin to sound like an alien, in our time. Like, you just sound like you come from another planet. Whereas this was so taken for granted, again, not just in Christian civilization, but Chinese civilization, every kind of pre-modern civilization kind of understood that it's important to regulate this force, because it's a powerful force, and it can do tremendous violence to people if it isn't kind of channeled, regulated, and surrounded with various guardrails.
It's another fascinating chapter, and in a way, it, along with all the other chapters, you're taking all of these kinds of wisdom from the ages, but often expressed through quite modern characters like Andrea Dworkin, and you're saying, here's the danger, here's what we lose if we forget what was laid down by our forebears and so on. So your son is now about, I don't know, 3 or 4 years old, probably?
4, sure, yeah.
4. When do you think you're going to give him this book and ask him to read it? What kind of reaction?
Oh, that's such a good question.
From?
No one, I've been doing book launch events for this book, and no one's asked that, and it's something that I wonder about. I think, given what we just talked about, the Andrea Dworkin chapter, I think he has to be 16 at least to be able to, because the Dworkin chapter is pretty pretty adult in a way. It's pretty frank. So I think 16 is the age I've come to.
And what are you hoping he'll take away? I mean, inevitably, a lot of the work is done, as the Jesuits say, give me the child and I'll give you the man. A lot of the shaping is done before the age of 16 in a technological age we live in. What kind of, given that, he might not be able to read the book till he's 16, what are you hoping you can instill in him of these ancient traditions and this wisdom that, frankly, he's not going to get through his smartphone and his MTV or whatever? What are you practically trying to do, Sohrab, to pass that on to the next generation?
It's not through the book, to be honest. The book, like I said, is going to be, and like you said, it'll be 16 by that time. Sure. By that time, this is a scary thing to say. By that time, it'll probably be too late. So what matters is education. And Plato said, education is just the work of teaching a child to love the right things, to admire the right things, and to, hate the wrong things, the things that deserve to be shunned. And so much of that is done not through rational discussions with children or through abstract declamations and so forth, but done through example and through communion between father and son, or mother and son, or child. And that's a heavy responsibility for anyone who's a parent. And in a sense, I'm saying, look, I hope that my book will shape my son's worldview. Yeah, but how I live is a lot more important.
Absolutely. It's a reminder for everyone doing the job of parenting. It's probably the most important job in the world, for which you require absolutely no qualifications. So it's an interesting one. We've got a comment in here. Let's include at least one before we start to wrap things up, Sohrab. And it's in regard to what we've just been talking about. This person asks, what advice do you have for parents who are navigating public education? How do we guide our kids to be grounded regardless of their surroundings? Because we can't wrap our kids in a bubble. They will inevitably be subject to whatever the latest morality is, or fashion, or whatever, especially in a sort of public space, in public education and so on. How How do you navigate that if you're wanting to instill different kinds of values?
I mean, I argue to counteract the really bad stuff, as much as you can. I think we're now moving towards an age of teaching children about not only kind of like subcultural sexualities and so forth, but even just sexuality in general to ever younger ages. I don't know why the kind of reigning ideology has such an obsession with transmitting this stuff in a way that just was unspeakable earlier, to earlier ages. So to try to block that stuff out. But on the other hand, I got fatherhood advice from a friend of mine who, by the way, he's Jewish. He's not a Christian. He's more secular than I am. But he gave me great advice, and that's I think it's what you said, Justin, which is to not bubble wrap. It is important for them because if you bubble wrap and these children who've just gone through private Christian academies only encountered views with which their parents agree, the minute they encounter kind of the secular, they will say, see, this is what my parents were hiding from me. Now I'm gonna embrace it full on.
Yeah.
To have conversations, that's what I plan to do. I mean, my kids were into Legoland and Paw Patrol. So right now it's too early, but when they get to the age where we can have really serious conversations, to have them read what quote unquote the other side says about things, and then talk through them in a somewhat didactic, but also open and reasonable way.
Yeah. When it comes to, on a broader scale, the next generation, a lot of what we've been talking about sounds a little bit like, oh dear, it's all going to hell in a handbasket. And, in a sense, arguably a bit pessimistic. Do you have hope? Do you have optimism for the future? And do you see any signs that what you're trying to do in the book, not forgetting our roots and the ancient wisdom, that it is being embraced anywhere, that people are kind of moving against the, simply read the latest Instagram post and you'll be fine kind of ideology?
Well, I mean, I'm called to have theological hope. So in the longest term, God's in control and everything's going to be fine. But in the immediate future, even in the immediate future, I have sources of optimism, and it's precisely young Christians. When I say young Christians, it makes me sound like I'm 70 years old, and I'm like, the young ones, but younger than me, I'm 36, but young Christians in their early 20s who recognize that some things have gone wrong, and they are preparing, but only how they kind of live their own lives to live them more purposefully and thoughtfully. How do they shape their own families and communities, but with an eye toward how do we reshape the public square? And they give me a lot of hope. So no, I'm not at all like it feels like we're living in a kind of science fiction dystopia sometimes, but I think there's a happy ending to that dystopian movie.
I'm sure there is. And like you, we are, even though it sometimes looks like things are going badly, we do have that ultimate hope. The Unbroken Thread is the book we've been talking about. Have a read of it. I really enjoyed it. And what I like about the book, Sohrab, is in a sense, it will open up people to a whole other range of thinkers, writers, and books. So once I'd finished the book, I thought, now I have about 5 to 10 other books that I want to go and read on the back of reading this one. And I know that you're a fan of always reading the old books as well as the new books. So, but I do encourage you to at least pick up this new book, The Unbroken Thread, Discovering the Wisdom of Tradition in an Age of Chaos. All the very best as you continue to talk about the book over in the USA as well, Sohrab. And thank you very much for joining me this evening.
Thank you, Justin. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to today's edition of The Profile with me, Justin Brierley, in which we've been airing the conversation I had with author Sohrab Ahmari, first broadcast for the UK launch of his recent book, The Unbroken Thread, Discovering the Wisdom of Tradition in an Age of Chaos. If you're listening via podcast, do check out the book details with today's show. You can find that at premierchristianradio.com/The Profile. Do rate and review us if you're listening to the podcast. It helps others discover the show. Otherwise, we'll be back next week with another great interview. See you then.